Christ the King, the Solemnity of Christ the King, was established by Pope Pius XI in 1925 in an encyclical called Quas Primas, which is Latin for "in the first." And one commentator said that this particular encyclical is arguably one of the most misunderstood and ignored encyclicals of all time. In response to which I thought to myself, well, I better read it at least once. And so as a starting point, to kind of paraphrase Pope Pius XI, basically what he says in the context of this encyclical is that there's never been a golden age in the history of the church. And so therefore, whenever we face particular problems in the context of this particular age in which we live, rather than get overwhelmed, rather than get discouraged, we're called to recognize that this is an opportunity to offer individually and through the church creative and powerful solutions to the problems at hand, and thereby give glory to God. And so I decided to use the example to kind of frame the issue. Think about the Protestant Reformation from the 16th century. And so in response to certain manifestations of evil and wickedness and corruption in the church, a lot of people backed away from the church. Some people even founded their own church. But in contrast, other people like St. Ignatius, St. Catherine of Siena, St. Charles Borromeo went the way of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. And so instead of stepping away, they stepped forward, looking to renew the church from the inside as opposed to giving up or simply stepping away. Now, along the same lines, Pope Pius XI, in the context of the encyclical, cites similar examples, but liturgically speaking. And so basically what he says is that from the early days of Christendom, the church has established various feast days associated with saints, with martyrs, with the Blessed Virgin Mary, to inspire people to live lives of heroic virtue. And so with that in mind, Pope Pius XI established, by way of the encyclical, a new solemnity, the Solemnity of Christ the King, in response to the increasing rise of secularism, as a result of which many individuals, many rulers, society at large, were becoming indifferent, if not overtly hostile, to the Christian cause. And so the whole idea behind the establishment of this particular solemnity was to respond to this particular cultural phenomenon by reaffirming the primacy of Christ the King, in our hearts, but also in the context of the world at large. And once you understand the origins of the Solemnity of Christ the King, hopefully you can see why it has enduring relevance even to this day. And this comes true in a really striking sort of way when you examine and study the decline in weekend mass attendance over the years. And so recently I just came back from this pre-seminar hosted by the Archdiocese of Toronto, which was focused on evangelization, but which began by citing a whole bunch of different studies, focusing on weekend mass attendance and the reasons why people were leaving that particular practice. And so basically in the context of the Archdiocese of Toronto, there's been a decline in weekend mass attendance from 2014 to 2019 by about 8.8%, so about 10%. Now, since COVID, from 2019 to 2023, there has been an even greater decline of 23%. Now, obviously, throughout the course of the seminar, we looked at various reasons why people ultimately left the practice of the faith, but perhaps I might summarize these reasons as such. So basically, before COVID, the main reason, the overwhelming reason why a lot of people left the practice of the faith was because of the undue influence of the culture, whether we're talking about secularism or the enormous pull towards individualism. And after COVID, these factors still existed, but they were fortified in a certain sense by a loss of a sense of duty, obligation, that sort of thing. Now, when you look at these different findings collectively, they reveal a few kind of interesting points when it comes to evangelization. First of all, this idea that when people leave the church, is often not because of some dispute with the church with regards to doctrine, or because of some scandal in the church. And that's certainly a factor, but it's pretty low when it comes to the totem pole, at least based on the study, at least based on the survey. And then instead what we're discovering through these various findings is that basically the reason why people are leaving the church is because God isn't really at the center of their lives. And so even when it comes to people who occasionally went to Mass before COVID, once the pandemic hit, and again, habit and obligation and duty went out the door, a lot of these people, they stopped coming to Mass, which reveals the fact that their devotion to Christ wasn't really too deep to begin with. And so at the end of the day, it was all just kind of duty and habit and obligation. Now, obviously, when you hear stuff like that, it's informative, but it can also be kind of demoralizing. So perhaps given all that, I might end this reflection by giving you some more kind of positive examples, beginning with the example of St. Benedict. And so as a matter of background, perhaps you may have heard about the so-called Dark Ages, this period of 900 years after the fall of the Roman Empire, but concluding with the coming of the Renaissance age. One of the great saints to rise up in the face of this dark period in the church, this dark period in the world, was again St. Benedict, who founded various monasteries in the continents of Europe, fortified by the so-called rule of St. Benedict, this rule that he established himself, which basically governed monastic life, built around prayer, the sacraments, community, stuff like that. As a result of which many good and faithful Catholics were able to withstand this really difficult period in time. But you see, here's the thing. In the words of Pope Benedict XVI, St. Benedict wasn't trying to reform civilization. No, instead, his mentality was that he simply looked at the world, which in a certain sense was going to hell. And he said to himself in a certain sense, now's the time to especially focus on what's important, what's essential, to do what the Lord wants us to do, to be who he wants us to be, to try our best to become really authentic Catholics, and to do those things which we've always known we ought to have been doing. And the end result was that he changed himself, he changed his monasteries, he changed the world. So as many of you know, my best friend in the whole wide world is Father Craig Cameron, this amazing priest from the Archdiocese of Halifax, Yarmouth. And basically, as I'm recording this, he has a million portfolios, right? He's the vocations director, he's the chaplain of the various post-secondary institutions, and so on and so forth. And as if he doesn't have enough to do, he basically took the initiative to engage in this really creative apostolic and evangelical endeavor by arranging for the Archdiocese to rent out 2 houses, one for men and one for women. And basically the whole idea is that whoever applies to these houses, amongst the students who do apply, they have to have a goal, like a plan for their life, but also on top of that, they have to observe a certain kind of common rule. Not like in a certain sense the rule of St. Benedict. So a common rule observing the foundations of prayer, community service, service of the parish, an examination of conscience, communal life, that sort of thing. And even though he's had these 2 houses for only 3 years, basically 2 guys from the men's house have now applied to the seminary. There's a 3rd guy through his work in chaplaincy who's also applied to the seminary. And in the context of the women's house, there are 3 women who are actively discerning right now a possible vocation to consecrated virginity. And so 5, 6 vocations in the context of 3 short years as a result of this really intentional and focused communal life built around prayer, built around the church. For myself, I noticed a similar thing back in the day when I was chaplain of the various post-secondary institutions in Oshawa. And so basically what we would do as our main recurring chaplaincy event was that after every Saturday Mass at the parish, so after confessions, after Mass, we would have this social in this intentional welcoming space in the context of the parish that was really pretty and intentionally designed for this particular purpose. And similar to Father Craig, in a matter of a few short years, we had 3 guys enter the seminary. We had 1 couple get married, and as I'm recording this, there's 1 couple who's recently been engaged who are scheduled to get married next year. So in the face of it, nothing too unique, nothing too different, until you read between the lines, right? Because if you read between the lines and you examine closely what's going on with both these different communities, you realize that they're both symptomatic of a listening heart, to quote again Pope Benedict XVI. And so in both cases, these kids, these students, they're not simply practicing their faith in an external sort of way. They're not doing it out of habit and duty and obligation and that sort of thing. They're doing it with intention. They're praying into their lives with a discerning and listening heart. What does the Lord want me to do? Who does he want me to be? They're recognizing the primacy of Christ the Lord in their lives, which of course is the whole point of Christ the King, to highlight the need of reestablishing this primacy, the primacy of Christ the King in our hearts, but also in the context of the world at large.